Hello, and welcome to another virtual IFAR evening hosted by the International Foundation for Art Research, better known as IFAR. I am Sharon Flescher, Executive Director. This evening, I'm wearing two hats, as your host right now, and also as one of the speakers. This is only the second time ever that I've done that. I have a lot to cover in this introduction, so please bear with me. Not surprisingly, given the quality of our speakers and the importance of the subject, this program is full. 500 registrants, our Zoom limit. Provenance, after all, has become an essential step in the due diligence process, both in regard to legal ownership and authenticity. That process that is now expected of museums, the marketplace, and individuals. But while provenance research is new to many people, it has been a core interest of IFAR's for 50 years. We are, after all, a nonprofit educational and research organization dedicated to integrity in the visual arts. From our founding purpose, which was attribution and authenticity, to our expansion into art theft in the 1970s, and then into the unresolved issues surrounding the restitution of Nazi-era looted art, and also cultural property issues, provenance research has been central to our activities. We provide many tools on our website to help people navigate provenance research, and you'll hear more about this later from my colleague, including our provenance guide, our catalog raisonnés database, and our art law and cultural property database. We also regularly include provenance information in the IFAR journal. And let's not forget, we created the stolen art database that's now administered by the Art Loss Register. So, what is provenance? And you'll hear more about this too later. Simply put, it's the history of ownership of an artwork, ideally tracked without gaps, all the way back to the artist himself. But that's not always possible. In fact, it's rare. With Nazi-era or cultural property claims, however, provenance refers to more, not simply from whom and to whom an artwork was transferred, but also the context of that transfer, something generally more difficult to determine and often disputed. Tonight's program will deal with provenance research from several angles and in relation to both authenticity and ownership restitution issues. But remember, this is an IFAR evening, not a full day conference. We actually organized a major conference on provenance and due diligence 21 years ago in April 2000 and published those proceedings. Maybe it's time we organize another one. 6 speakers, however distinguished, and they are, can possibly cover all the relevant areas in a little less than 2 hours. But we will cover a lot and with new material. And we'll leave a little time for questions at the end. Tonight's program coincides with the US distribution of Provenance Research Today, a new book edited by Arthur Tompkins and co-published by IFAR with Lund Humphries. I want to give a shout out now to Lund Humphries, watching us from England, staying up late, and acknowledge their help in supporting this program. 3 of tonight's speakers, Marc Masurovsky, Jennifer Mass, and I contributed chapters to the book. At the end of the program, I'll come back and remind you of a discount book offer to program registrants and IFAR member supporters. Now for some program logistics. Each of our speakers will speak for around 10 to 15 minutes. Your questions will be addressed at the end, the very end, after all the talks. But you can write your questions at any time by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Please, please, I beg you, keep those questions short. Now, for the sequence of the talks and a brief introduction of each speaker, which I will not provide again. First will be Lynn Nicholas, whom I'll introduce in a moment. She will be followed by Marc Masurovsky, co-founder of HARP, the Holocaust Art Restitution Project, and also the academic director of the new Jewish Digital Cultural Recovery Project, which he'll tell you about. Then I will return to speak about some of the challenges in provenance research, and I will be followed by Dr. Lisa Duffy-Zeballos, IFAR's art research director, who will focus on the importance of catalogues raisonnés for provenance research. Following Lisa will be Dr. Jennifer Mass, President of Scientific Analysis of Fine Art and also the Mellon Professor at the Bard Graduate Center. She'll tell us how science can help verify provenance, truly fascinating. And holding up the fort will be Tom Kline, an art law attorney and partner at Cultural Heritage Partners. He'll discuss legal issues surrounding provenance research. Now to Lynn Nicholas. It is commonplace to say that some people need no introduction, but with Lynn Nicholas and an audience interested in provenance, that's true. Her pioneering book, The Rape of Europa, came out 27 years ago and is still, in my opinion, one of the very best, if not the best, books on World War II art looting. Its publication was a turning point in the restitution field. She's an old friend of IFAR's, having spoken for us previously, both before and after the publication of the book. So without further delay, let me give you Lynn Nicholas.
Well, I'd like to start by thanking you for organizing this wonderful session on the mysterious, ever mysterious subject of provenance. I think I gave my very first talk in total fear and trembling here at IFAR. Actually, was in the last century, not too far back in the last century, but it's fun to say that. And ever since then, their sympathetic encouragement and responses when, for information have been really great help to me and probably to the rest of us. And so I'm eternally grateful to you for all that. Although Sharon has already given you a little definition, I give you my definition by starting this evening by saying, what is provenance exactly? And essentially it is the total body of verifiable knowledge that can be attached to a particular object from its creation to the present moment. Now, verifiable is the key word, where you can never assume everything and you have to look up everything 3 or 4 times and get backup information. And a history like that requires great diligence, the other part of our title, and constant updating, because new information is always becoming available and old information is often disproven. The fact that a verified provenance exists, however, does not mean that all players will make use of all of its data. Really quite the opposite. Depending on his interests, each person will extract and present from the available data whatever is most useful to him. And there are still to this day no formal rules for what should be mentioned in a provenance. In a published provenance, for instance, controversial dealers, previous owners who might cause difficulties, such as Nazis, or those who were lost in the Holocaust who might make claims, or known traffickers in antiquities are frequently just left out or described with euphemisms such as a private European collector. One of my favorite ones is a private South Bavarian collector, which turned out to actually be Goering. But anyway, these euphemisms are used all the time. And no insult to Tom, but lawyers involved in art litigation are particularly good at such sins of omission, which often only an experienced researcher can recognize. Well, in the olden days, provenance was mainly concerned with authentication, and by the late 18th century or so, it had become an important tool for the art trade, especially in France, which of course, in those days had a far more limited clientele than at present. Was a painting really painted by the master, and where did it fit within his oeuvre? In the case of archaeology, where was it found, and was it actually genuine? I can remember years ago being given a tiny carved head from somewhere in the Middle East and being told that the only way to be sure of its genuineness was to immerse it in water, and if it was real, it would dissolve. So I decided to believe the provenance as it was told to me. Authenticity, of course, affects the value as well as the reputation of a collection. So it's of great interest to dealers now and in the past to get approvals from whoever is or was the big expert of the moment in each field. I think of people like Friedlander or Berenson. And these expertise are often featured in a provenance, even if sometimes they were clearly given under some sort of duress or financial arrangement. In the past, who it belonged to was much less important often, unless the previous owner had celebrity status like Napoleon or King Tut or Jackie Onassis or Louis XIV or something like that, or if a collection was known to be full of masterpieces. So that's why, for example, that even the Nazis would note that a drawing or painting was from, say, the Jewish Rothschild collections or the Slavic Lubomirska collections, as that showed that they had looted only the very best stuff. And later on, that's also why, having been owned by Hitler or Goering or by a Holocaust victim was for so long omitted from sales or exhibition catalogs or even catalog raisonnés, as it could lead to uncomfortable questions. And sometimes it was personal. I remember looking at one big Dutch vanity catalog of someone's collection, and he had left out a dealer because he'd had a fight with him and just didn't like him, so he just didn't put him in, although the dealer had been an important part of the whole negotiation for this work. So we've seen lots of provenance with gaps, and even many in these days with no information at all, especially for the middle of the 20th century, when things became awkward for many dealers and auction houses and indeed collectors. It's important to note that there's still no legal requirements for provenance. What's included in published provenance continues to be dictated by political or marketing needs, or sometimes, if it's an exhibition catalog, by how much space is available on a page. But now, due to the revival of World War II restitution issues and the litigation surrounding them in the last 25 years, provenance of objects that are to be sold or exhibited or donated are now subjected to far greater scrutiny. So the research required before a sale or exhibition is approved and the great increase in claims has really created a new profession. Today's provenance researchers cannot just limit themselves to art history, although that is certainly a very vital element in their work, but they must be aware of the whole context in which an object existed. For items looted in World War II, this means knowledge of ideologies, timelines of political events, and often hour by hour, the knowledge, really did change hour by hour, and particularly in the late 30s or early 30s too. And you have to know multiple languages and much more. You have to be aware of the ever-changing export and exit tax regulations in Nazi Germany, of the immigration and labor laws of Switzerland, of the uses of international exhibitions in the 1930s to send items out of harm's way, of Swiss bank records, of wills and estates, insurance and shipping manifests, And all of these things are used or can be used to trace the path of an object through time and may unexpectedly validate ownership and reveal if there was wrongdoing or not. Excuse me. Fortunately, the revolution in provenance studies has coincided with the explosion of data now available online. So we all look forward to a time, I think, when we can feed an image into a central database and get the whole story back in 10 seconds. And there are a lot of projects working on just that. I think of Pharos, which is a French project, I believe, which is a picture base. The many projects of the Getty Research Institute, and many, many more, both here and abroad. But alas, so far the 10 seconds is just a dream, because the vast amounts of information now at our fingertips are very fragmented, and there's no standard format for provenance or efficient linkage of websites still to this day. Thus, there's still no substitute for days spent reading dusty letters and actually the wonderful serendipity of hands-on archival research. The revolution in the field of World War II restitution began more or less in the late 1990s, and there were many catalysts. A very important one was the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the resulting revelations of thousands of works that were still held there. Things like the Swiss banking inquiries, the coming of age of Holocaust studies, the celebrations marking the 50th anniversary of the end of World War II, and so forth, all of which combined to revive the possibilities of restitution claims for items that were thought to have been lost forever. An impetus also, I must say, encouraged by the exponential rise in the values of works of art in the late 20th century. Things that, for example, had been worth, drawings or that had been worth practically nothing during the Nazi era suddenly had become very valuable indeed, and that did help focus attention on the restitution process, which is, very expensive and very difficult for many people. The art world, which taken unawares by this whole revelation, was totally unprepared for the revolution and the evasive responses of museums at the time, which was really, I think, caused in large part by their total ignorance of the details of long past World War II looting, which had been overtaken long since by other issues in the late 60s or the early 60s. This ignorance did nothing to, and their defensiveness did nothing to enhance their reputations. Governments and politicians, on the other hand, responded a lot faster. I mean, there are really few subjects more likely to get attention and votes than looted treasure, hidden gold, Nazis, and the possibility of restitution. The Washington Conference on Holocaust-era Assets in 1998, where many of these issues were aired, along with refugee problems and Swiss bank issues and much, much more. But the resulting fervor would soon lead to a plethora of highly publicized claims for works of art, and it became a very hot subject. Not all the claims were valid, but all would require enormous amounts of research in order to prove cases one way or the other. And this is something that only the biggest museums could and can afford. But in the last 20 years, they have really, if slowly, risen to the challenge and have produced or underwritten huge amounts of useful data. And by now, most major museums have dedicated provenance operations, and many also boast high-powered research institutions. The Getty, the National Archives, the Archives of American Art, and the Frick, among and many, many more, have the museum systems of most European nations have undertaken prodigious digitization and research projects. I mean, you think of things like the huge Getty Heidelberg University digitization of German auction catalogues, ranging from, they started with 1933 to 45, and now I think it goes back to 1901, which is just an extraordinary resource. And we all wish that they would, do the ones from 45 on, and I'm sure that probably is in the works. And the major auction houses too have very sophisticated and generously staffed vetting operations, which they use before anything is accepted for a sale. But all is still far from perfect. The lack of international communication links and actually the human reluctance to share information has people tend to hoard their research and not want to tell anybody else about it. This has all led to an unfortunate siloing and duplication of research efforts. That's been mitigated in part by the simply amazing number of symposia, conference courses, and international meetings, such as the hugely successful 3-year-long Smithsonian prep exchanges between German and American museums. And there are many, many more. Marc Masurovsky, who will be talking to you next, has done courses in Europe, and as have we all, I believe. So all of these events allow researchers to describe their work when they can get together and discuss common problems and create access to unknown but incredibly useful research and data. But we still have a long way to go in the sharing department. Despite all the efforts and attention to the issues of restitution and provenance, the field and its difficulties are really not very well understood. Laymen, and particularly the media, seem to think that every painting is sort of is a unique, unchanging subject, and they can't understand why they're hard to find. And few seem to be aware that artists and their assistants, especially in the past, often did multiple identical versions of one scene, or that old aunts, this is actually true, my husband's old aunt, sometimes cut undesirable relatives out of a group portrait and then had it reframed so that nothing is the same, the size and the people are in it, etc. And that was not unusual in the past either. Or, for instance, that the same work can have a different title and attribution every single time it's sold or exhibited, and that there are many, many fakes and copies made in different eras, and that over and over researchers reach a dead end because a dealer or collector records have been lost or destroyed, or at least one is told that they've been lost or destroyed. Whether they really have is often questionable. So provenance research, therefore, is detective work of the most intensive nature that often ends without definitive conclusions being possible. But here today we have my fellow panelists who are all experts in various aspects of this demanding science, and they will tell you much, much more. And so it's with great pleasure to turn the discussion over to Masurovsky.
Thank you, Lynn. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you again to Sharon for including me in this event. I'm going to talk to you about the JDCRP, and secondly, about this pilot project that essentially is the first major project of the project itself. So the JDCRP was founded and incorporated in 2019 as a Berlin-based foundation. And the reason for the JDCRP's existence is in effect to take over a little bit where the EAR project database has left off, in the sense that, it went live in 2010. Its purpose was to document losses, Jewish cultural losses in Western Europe, with special emphasis on French losses. Currently, the database has about 40,000 data sets, but it also has demonstrated its severe limitations, and we wanted to essentially create a more structured environment in which the database could be overhauled. So out of that basically grew the idea of an NGO, which could also act as an informal consortium amongst the various stakeholders who have a direct interest in this kind of project. And these are, for instance, archives in Europe and the United States, specialized libraries like in Munich, in Holland, in France, and in the States, and also relevant government ministries with a direct interest in these types of cultural issues, but also in terms of the significant impact of displaced objects landing in public and private collections throughout the world. So these are basically the institutions that frame the JDCRP. In 2019, we applied for a grant from the European Union, thanks to the fact that we were incorporated in Europe. We obtained a funding for a pilot project. That's all it is, it's a prototype, a proof of concept to demonstrate the feasibility of designing and creating a database of stolen art. Now, obviously, having worked on the ER database for 15 years, that question is already answered, but the real interest behind this grant is to see if there is another way, a more interactive, a more dynamic way, a more creative way of presenting historical information coming from primary sources that document the displacement of objects, cultural objects in Europe between 1933 and 1945 and their subsequent fate in the post-war years. Now, keep in mind that this is not a restitution project. It is a technology project, basically going hand in hand with research, historical research, and the combination of the two is supposed to generate methodologies that are probably already well known to the research community, but also trying to elucidate different types of approaches that might actually get us closer to some of our intended targets. And one of the main targets is actually to close or to narrow the gaps of knowledge in a provenance, as Sharon described earlier. So that is basically the reason why I'm here today, is to sort of briefly talk to you about this database. So in short, the database itself is not like other databases in the sense that it is not centered on the object. It doesn't neglect the object, but it basically pays equal or more attention to the events that frame the object. So in other words, we recognize that in order for objects to move from one place to another, they don't exactly get picked up by a stork and get dropped off somewhere else, but it requires a person or an institution or company or a combination thereof to move these objects from one place to another. Whether their movement is licit or illicit is for the researcher to figure out. And as a result of that, we realized that by putting an emphasis on the relationships between the people, the entities, the organizations, and other types of factors that essentially frame the movement, but also the fate of these objects, we might be able to come up with some more interesting results that might actually help us understand more the context in which these objects have evolved, but also give us a little bit more information, possibly about where they might have gone in case we don't have that kind of information available. So our efforts under a fairly crushing schedule have been precisely to devise a data model which addresses all these questions and more, and at the same time to basically come up with methodologies which allow us to explore how we can fill or how we can narrow the gap in knowledge about specific objects. And it is quite challenging for anybody who has ever attempted this. Now, the environment in which this grant has evolved has also been a challenge, which is the pandemic. So a project that required us basically to conduct research on site in archives across Europe and in the United States or in specialized libraries, and to hold meetings, face-to-face meetings with programmers, researchers, government officials, and other specialists to aid in this project could basically become moot, and this entire world that we left temporarily back last March 2020 has been replaced with a very virtual and a very imperfect structure through which we were supposed to conduct a project that otherwise required a physical presence in wherever we wanted to go. So the first challenge is that the archives were shuttered. So how do you do research on a provenance which is gruesomely incomplete without having access to archives, specialized libraries, private collections, or private archives and so forth? Well, I can honestly say that the last 12 months have been nothing short of a litmus test of the limitations and also the strengths of digital research, or in other words, what I like to refer to as kitchen research. So you're there, you're in your pajamas, you don't leave, and then you try to do all your research, you try to run this kind of project without even getting out of your house. In normal circumstances, I would have said that was completely crazy, because there's only so much that you can do sitting at home, typing on a keyboard, because eventually you're gonna have to get up and do exactly what Lynn suggested, which is get your hands dirty and look at dusty archives and consult the records there. But unfortunately, we didn't have that privilege. And except for specific online archives like fold3.com and others, this project would basically been dead on arrival. So to give you a little bit more insight into what we have in mind, we've decided basically to digitize every aspect of the provenance, including the sales and the exhibitions, so that every single aspect of the provenance can essentially be searchable, queried, and basically linked to individuals like collectors and dealers, gallery owners, to entities like auction houses, and also the galleries of the particular dealers, as well as the people who essentially were involved in the illicit movement of these objects, because our focus, we had to use a collection as a vector by which to do this work. So we picked a collection of old masters, well documented in France, which had approximately 333 paintings in it. And so the idea was to basically use this collection as a means to test, if you want, the feasibility of such a project. Now, it's not a fine arts database. It's simply, for the sake of the exercise, we picked a coherent collection as a pretext, if you want, to test whatever questions that we had. And by basically decentering, if you want, the way of looking at an object, and by recontextualizing the object in the events that surrounded, our idea is that this should basically allow you to enrich your view of the history of this object and to understand much more about what goes into taking an object from point A to point B. Why do you want to confiscate, how you confiscate, and what happens after you confiscate? What happens when you look for the work of art, when you recover it, and when you bring it back and return it to its rightful owners, if that's the case? Or what happens and how do you search for an object that basically disappeared in Never Never Land after the end of the Second World War? So these and many more questions we hope to be able to address, even if it's just to raise even more question marks, because as you can probably divine, in this particular collection, 1/3 of the paintings have absolutely no provenance to them, except for the critical moments before, during, and immediately after the war. So with the pandemic, it's been nothing short of impossible to basically even attempt to fill these gaps, but still, we don't give up that easily. And if we can't do that, then at least what we'll do and present to the public possible methodologies by which these gaps can be addressed in a scientific, empirical way. So that's essentially, in a very reduced fashion, the nuts and bolts of this particular project. And of course, like any of these projects, they're always underfunded. And also, all this work has to be accomplished in ridiculous deadlines. So therefore, the delivery of this pilot project will be at some point this summer, the summer of 2021, assuming that no other major global emergency intervenes. So one of the deliverables, which I think should be of interest to folks out there who like to work with databases, is that we're going to make the data model available for public use. There's no reason to hide it, and there's no reason to make it proprietary, because this is an effort that requires a tremendous amount of collaboration. And in that regard, I wanted to sort of echo some of Lynn's concerns about the current environment that we've been living in with respect of sitting on research, not wanting to share it. And I have to say that, and perhaps this is just an exception, but this project has proven just about the opposite. it required a tremendous amount of international cooperation. In fact, without that cooperation, I wouldn't be here talking to you because I'd be too embarrassed to do so. But because of the amazing efforts deployed by archives, research libraries, both in the United States and in Europe, we've been able to basically keep this project going and moving it forward. They've shared documents with us. They've allowed us limited access to their facilities and made it as easy as possible for us to basically take advantage of certain windows of opportunity while these archives were open. And I'm talking specifically about the Courneuve in north of Paris, the Archives Nationales southeast and southwest of Paris, the RKD in the Netherlands, and also the ZIKG in Munich. And I'm forever grateful to all the people who work there because they've really made our task significantly easier. But I have to insist on the fact that that cooperation is essential for any similar kind of project taking place, regardless of the subject matter, whether we're talking about antiquities, indigenous objects, Holocaust-related material. It is absolutely vital to have these institutions work together and cooperate in a collegial fashion, and particularly the specialists. So again, maybe this is just an exception, but we've been blessed with an incredible team of researchers from 3 or 4 different countries who have worked together, albeit virtually, sharing information, sharing documents, sharing concerns and research questions, and basically always being engaged in such a way that the ball can basically move forward on a regular basis. And we have had our share of hiccups, and right now we're sort of running into the biggest hiccup, which is to make this data model actually function properly once it's delivered to a website, which, if all goes well, would be live also at some point this summer or in early fall. So the lessons of all this is the international cooperation, the collegiality that has to exist amongst researchers. It's nothing to be embarrassed about. Your research is just as good as anybody else's, and you share it, we respect each other, and that's the way it ought to be, and there should be no polarization of research, especially not about cultural objects. What I do want to say is that this pandemic has really shown us how very limiting online research can be. And even if it is about Dutch old masters and Flemish old masters, not all of them are born equal. And many of them have not been given the right type of attention by art historians, which means that they don't really exist on the internet, and therefore you can't find much of anything about them or about their works. So to conclude, I want to basically emphasize that these projects, which are meant to bring together data, historical data from all sorts of places, are feasible, but they always require an act of political will. So where you have the will to do it, you'll definitely find a way to do it. These are not short-term projects that can happen overnight. A database like the one that we're working on right now is it's not so much a labor of love, but it's something that has to take place over a number of years. So, none of this is really going to be fully accomplished in the way that we want it to be until maybe 5 years from now, assuming again that everything goes right. So I wanted to sort of end on this note, and if you have questions, I'll be happy to answer them. And now I want to turn it over to Sharon Flescher, who's the Executive Director of IFAR and our host tonight.
I've already introduced myself. I'm Sharon Flescher, Executive Director of IFAR, and my task is to lay out just some of the many challenges involved in provenance research, both from the point of view of authenticity and ownership claims. While these areas often utilize different archival resources and may raise different legal and ethical concerns, the research methodology is very similar. Perhaps nothing underscores, excuse me for that delay of turning on my screen share, perhaps nothing underscores the challenges of provenance research so much as the announcement last May of the disbanding of the joint German-Swiss provenance project dedicated to researching the so-called Gurlitt Trove of approximately 1,500 artworks found in 2012 in the homes of Cornelius Greulich. As is now well known, Cornelius was the reclusive son of a German curator who was also a dealer during the Nazi era. It was he who had amassed the collection. Many of the works in the trove were suspected of having been looted. When Cornelius died in 2014, he bequeathed the collection to the Kunstmuseum in Bern, Switzerland, which accepted it with the understanding that the provenance of the works would all be researched and any work shown to have been looted would be restituted. Just 3 months ago in January, the last work from the collection, the 14th, that had been positively identified as looted, a drawing by Karl Spitzweg, was restituted. So, after several years of research under varying entities, some of which were criticized, millions of euros spent, teams of researchers, and a reported hundreds of remaining works with provenance gaps, although as we all know, provenance gaps alone do not mean that a work was looted, the research closed down. In the words of the project director, quote, "Whatever research was possible, we've exhausted it." Presumably, if new information comes to light, they'll pursue it. Notably, when the research started around 2013, the prediction was it would take only 1 year. In an article in the IFAR journal, however, we predicted otherwise. Why? Because small, inexpensive works that make up the bulk of the Greulich collection, forget the Cézanne, Manet, and Matisse, are particularly difficult to research. There often is little exhibition or publication history, and because of the lower value, documents may not only have gotten lost over the years, they may not have been saved in the first place. So let me now highlight some basic challenges that apply to all categories of provenance research. You've already heard from Lynn and Marc about the inaccessibility of archival materials, although that's less problematic now in the digital era, and you'll soon be hearing about the need to check multiple catalogues raisonnés where they exist on a particular artist. To these challenges and caveats, let me add the fact that titles or descriptions of artworks change or get mistranslated. Attributions change, measurements change, multiple variants of the same work, as Lynn Nicholas mentioned, by the same artist may exist. Documents disappear over time, especially in the upheaval of war. Incorrect owners' names get attached. Dealers and auction houses may be mentioned in the provenance rather than the owners. And of course, many dealers' names regarding Nazi-era artwork have been red flagged. New provenance information isn't always incorporated. Labels, stamps, collector's marks, and inventory numbers can be misread, or they fall off, or they may be intentionally removed. And let's not forget what Lynn has already referred to, that all too familiar phrase, private collection. For all these and other reasons, provenance research is challenging and provenance information needs to be verified. To paraphrase a former US president, trust but verify. These challenges arise even when there's no attempt to dissimulate. But where provenance is concerned, duplicity is commonplace. I'd like to turn now to a few intentional provenance falsifications in relation to authenticity. Falsified documents and fraudulent ownership histories generally accompany unknown works by major artists that spring up seemingly out of nowhere. Let me remind you of the notorious Beltracchi scam, where a large cache of new artworks by modern masters, all fake, was accompanied by provenance documents showing that the works had belonged to what turned out to be an entirely fictitious pre-war collection called the Jaegers collection. Staged and intentionally aged photographs showed the fake works on the walls of a 1930s era furnished apartment. But it was Beltracchi's own wife sitting in that apartment in modern days. Some of the works bore phony labels, ostensibly showing that they once belonged to Alfred Flechtheim, a German Jewish art dealer whose collection had been dispersed early in the 1930s. The labels superficially looked good, but when they were studied more closely, they aroused the suspicion of a scholar who sounded alarms. Once these and other suspicions were aroused, scientific tests were done, anachronistic materials were found on the paintings and on the labels, and the scam was exposed. This highlights a tricky area. While labels and other markings and certificates and sales receipts, photos, and so on are essential for provenance research, they're also grist for the faker's mill. I will now give you briefly some other examples, just focusing on one artist, Jackson Pollock, drawn from IFAR's own Art Authentication Research Service, where provenance research has been an integral component, of the three-pronged approach to authentication research that, we've espoused for 50 years. I'm showing a sales receipt dated 1952, said to be from the Betty Parsons Gallery in New York, which accompanied a purported Pollock painting submitted to us. You see it there. Parsons was Pollock's dealer. Aside from the many stylistic reasons that made a Pollock attribution implausible, and the fact that the painting didn't appear on the dealer's own handwritten list of works sold by her that year, the receipt itself was suspicious. The paper was too pristine, and it bore no resemblance to the gallery's other receipts. Even more damning, examination showed it was written with a Pentel type nylon-tipped pen that had not been invented until 11 years later. Notably, the phony receipt was accompanied by an affidavit signed by the owner's friend, attesting to the fact that she was with the owner in the gallery when the work was purchased. Adding insult to injury and further muddying the documentary evidence, the owner later doctored the cover letter that I myself wrote accompanying the negative report and changed our negative opinion into a positive one when she tried to sell the work. Truth. In a more famous IFAR project, that of the purported Pollock painting acquired from the Nodler Gallery and submitted by the owner to IFAR for research. The work came with a seemingly plausible provenance listing Alfonso Osorio, Pollock's early patron, but it was accompanied by the barest of ownership histories and no documents. This project was highlighted in the documentary Made You Look that's now showing on Netflix. And if you haven't seen it, it's fun to watch. We researched the Osorio provenance extensively and could not substantiate it. Of course not, the painting was a forgery and the provenance was concocted, as was the new David Herbert provenance that the gallery assigned to the work less than 3 weeks after we sent our report to the owner saying we couldn't accept the work, and he had asked the gallery for his money back. In another notorious fake scam, oh, I forgot to show you, this is the painting that was involved, sorry, in the Nodler case. In another notorious fake scam, conceived by Long Island con man John Ray, a fictitious provenance of George Schulte, an East Hampton furniture restorer, was given to a group of around 150 de Kooning and Pollock fakes. In all, IFAR examined 48 of those purported Pollocks. Again, the provenance had some plausibility and an East Hampton connection, but we could not substantiate it. The scam was bolstered. Oh, here's one of the works from that group. And the scam was bolstered by notarized documents signed by Schulte's widow, whose mental state may have been exploited, saying that Schulte had acquired the works directly from Pollock. Not true. I should add that the works themselves didn't hold up to scrutiny, stylistically or forensically, and Ray was later indicted. He pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison. A fake provenance and falsified documents also factored into a more recent scam that we uncovered. This scam involved hundreds of works said to belong to a German-born American collector, James Brenneman. We could find no evidence of his existence, not his birth, nor death, nor immigration papers into the US. 4 works from his collection were submitted to IFAR by 3 different owners. They were accompanied by a huge dossier of letters and photographs, all phony. And I'm going to say as an aside that there's sort of a saying in the field that the bigger the portfolio, the less likely the work is to be authentic. But that's only sometimes true. The photos included images of his, here's one of the works just to show you what they look like. The photos were accompanied by this huge dossier and photos of his supposed mansion in Chicago. You see the south entrance on the left, but the pictures were actually a composite view of the Sforza Castle in the Milan, which you see on the right, and an 18th century Bavarian church. I'm telling you, you can't make these things up, truly, from what's coming into us. The letters ostensibly documented how he acquired much of his collection. The paintings bore bogus labels and inventory numbers on the verso. Not incidentally, the paintings too were unconvincing and had anachronistic materials. I'm going to end my talk by returning to a World War II example, which underscores the challenges and rewards of dogged provenance research. This involved a multi-year search by the Meadows Museum in Dallas to prove that 2 Murillo paintings in its collection had been restituted after World War II and were therefore acquired legally by the museum in 1972. The museum's published provenance didn't indicate a looting history, but in 2006, Robert Etzel, in the course of his research for the Monuments Men, found evidence that the paintings had been in the possession of the Nazis. Here's one of them, the Santa Justa, in the studio of a Nazi-era art restorer, 1945. A subsequent examination of the works showed a barely visible Rothschild ERR number, you heard Marc discuss the ERR, on the back of the Santa Justa. Thus began a 7-year search by the museum to clear up the history. The search was complicated by the historic conflation of their Murillos with another set belonging to the Duke of Sutherland in the 19th century. There were numerous research dead ends, but a chance finding proved determinative. While the ERR number had shown that the works belonged to the Rothschild family before the war, the Meadows researcher could find no mention of them under the various Rothschilds in the wartime claims files in France until a perusal of a file box labeled with the letters J through M revealed a Baronne Antoinette Leonino, the granddaughter of Gustav de Rothschild. A post-it note, which you're seeing, on top of Leonino's file provided the clue. Armed with this information, the museum was able to verify that the paintings had been restituted to Leonino and were therefore acquired legally by the museum. With that happy but circuitous resolution, I'd like to turn the platform over to my colleague at IFAR, Dr. Lisa Duffy-Zeballos. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon. Sharon had mentioned in the beginning in her introduction, IFAR's long history with the subject of provenance. We've long recognized the importance of provenance research to the art world, from verifying authenticity, of course, indicating who may have had access to the artwork throughout its history. Provenance can provide information regarding the painting's current condition, physical condition, and of course, to redress wrongs caused by theft, Holocaust-related losses, and looting. Before I discuss the role of catalog raisonnés in provenance, I want to mention 3 of IFAR's online resources, which can be used to facilitate provenance research, and I have them on the screen. The first is the Art Law and Cultural Property Database, which includes cultural property legislation from all over the world and summaries of legal cases, many involving provenance and restitution. IFAR's comprehensive provenance guide is a downloadable 25-page how-to guide to researching provenance. It includes links to Holocaust-related art loss databases, archival repositories and digitized records, important image archives like Pharos, which has been mentioned, databases of looted antiquities and cultural objects, and professional guidelines and legislation. It is continually updated, and as recently as today. So there are new resources online just as of a couple hours ago. IFAR's Catalog Raisonné database is a free database of all known, published, and in preparation catalog raisonnés. Catalog raisonnés are scholarly compilations of an artist's total oeuvre or complete works within defined parameters, such as all of the paintings, all portraits, however the authors have defined it. By definition, they are comprehensive and systematically organized, providing essential information on each work listed. Typically, this includes a photograph, physical details, bibliography, exhibition history, provenance, and current owner. They can also list known variants, lost works, and rejected attributions. IFAR's database currently includes more than 4,500 catalog raisonnés on over 3,000 artists. Each annotated entry in the database includes information on what the catalog covers and how it relates to other catalog raisonnés and editions on the artist. There are also links to WorldCat and digitized content, if available. Some artists, like Rembrandt, are the subject of multiple catalog raisonnés, which are in turn often reissued over the years in various editions, reprintings, and supplemental volumes. So it can be challenging to identify and access all of these different publications, weigh their respective merits, and learn how to distinguish between them. This is especially daunting since due diligence often requires one to consult all relevant catalogs, including previous editions, in order to identify any additional information and discrepancies. My first case in point is something that I'm sure is very well known to most of you, or many of you. This is Egon Schiele's portrait of Wally. It was a well-known case in which the subject of it was the subject of a restitution with the heirs of Lea Bonde-Jure, a Jewish Austrian art dealer. The case began with the seizure of a painting in an exhibition in the United States in 1997 and was finally settled in 2010. And much of the evidence from the case came from the artist's catalog raisonnés. Bonde acquired the portrait of Wally in 1925, and it was listed in her collection in Vienna in Otto Kalier's 1930 catalog raisonné, and you see the entry here. In 1938, Austrian Jews were forced to sell their businesses to Aryans, and a Nazi named Friedrich Welz acquired Lea Bonde's gallery and demanded the portrait of Wally, which was in her home. She surrendered it without compensation and fled the country. After the war, US forces wrongfully restituted the portrait of Wally to the wrong Jewish family, to Dr. Heinrich Rieger. It was eventually acquired in 1954 by the Austrian collector Rudolf Leopold, and it later went to the Leopold Museum in Vienna. All this time, Bonde was still looking for her painting. She even contacted Leopold in 1953 to see if he had any information about her missing work. He bought it a year later. In 1966, Otto Kallir wrote a revised edition of his 1930 catalogue raisonné, listing it as formerly belonging to Bondy and currently in the collection of Rudolf Leopold. And you can see it here. You see the all four of the previous owners listed there. Rudolf Leopold, meanwhile, wrote his own catalogue raisonné of Sheila in 1972-73. There are two editions, two different language editions. Leopold's catalogue only listed the first owners of the works and other owners if they were significant to the history of the painting. Otherwise, he refers his reader to Kallir's earlier catalogues for the full provenance. This enabled him to omit Bondy from the ownership history of her painting, and he also obscured the fact that he himself owned it. Leopold's lack of transparency regarding his ownership is not unique to this case. Current owners sometimes request anonymity in the catalogue raisonné, requiring authors to list them as private collection, even if their ownership has been published elsewhere. This is a way of attempting to control the historical record of ownership of the work of art, ensure privacy, and to enforce researchers to search for information that really should be readily available in the catalogue raisonné. In the Sheila case, obviously, a researcher who relied only on the Leopold catalogue would have missed critical information about the painting's World War II history. IFAR's catalogue raisonné database, annotated entry on Leopold's catalogue, therefore, discusses its methodology in listing provenance and cautions that it should be consulted in conjunction with the earlier catalogues by Otto Kallir and the later catalogues by Jane Kallir. This is the most recent catalogue raisonné of Sheila. It was done by Jane Kallir and the Kallir Research Project. It is an online catalogue raisonné from that began in 2019. And you can see here that the provenance is remarkably complete. All dates of ownership are given, and the sources of the information are also listed. For example, we see that the Leopold Museum still owns the work as part of a settlement with Bondy's heirs. This case highlights that some of the catalogues, in this case deceptively, do not always provide the full information and instead leave it to the researcher to conduct other volumes or editions, or even catalogues by other authors for essential information. It also underscores the need to look at the author's methodology and to see how a current volume revises or doesn't revise earlier editions. This is true even of different language editions of a catalogue raisonné. In one famous case, that of Klimt's Blooming Meadow, as a result of an ownership dispute, the English and German editions of the 2007 catalogue contain different World War II provenance information. Of course, our IFAR's catalogue raisonné database for this catalog mentions the discrepancy because we know about it, but of course there must be many others. The second case that I'm going to discuss involves an ownership dispute over a Van Gogh painting formerly owned by the actress Elizabeth Taylor, which was subject of a restitution claim by the heirs of its Jewish owner, Margareta Mautner. In this example, too, the publication dates of the various editions of the Van Gogh catalogues were critical in attempting to determine whether it had been sold under duress. The earliest catalogue of Van Gogh was Jacob Bart de la Faye's 1928 catalogue raisonné, which lists Mautner, Berlin, as the owner. This established her ownership prior to World War II. When the second edition came out in 1939, it still listed Mautner as the current owner. For the claimants, this timing was critical because it showed she still owned the work when she fled Germany for South Africa in 1939. They claimed that this proved that she must have sold it under duress to fund her escape from the Nazis. For her part, Taylor's side argued that Mautner could have sold it before 1939, noting that as catalogue raisonnés take a long time to complete, there could be a time lag between when the information is compiled and when the book was actually published. De la Faye died while working on the third edition of the catalogue raisonné. It was begun in 1959 and completed by a consortium of scholars in 1970. This edition showed that the work had passed from Mautner to a dealer and then to Alfred Wolff sometime before 1949. Taylor had purchased it from an auction of his estate, Wolff's estate, in 1963. What we're looking at here is the 1970 catalogue raisonné, and we can see that Taylor is listed twice. There's the catalog information is broken up in the book so that the description and the current owner is listed with the photograph in the catalog section. And then in the back is the provenance section where we can see Margareta Mauthner as a former owner, Wolf, and Elizabeth Taylor as the current owner. The question of whether the Van Gogh was subject of a sale under duress was not resolved by the court. The court instead ruled that the heir simply took too long to bring their 2003 complaint. Without going into the many complex details of the case, the court cited the fact that Mauthner's prior ownership and Elizabeth Taylor's purchase of the Van Gogh was publicly discoverable to the heirs in various sources, most notably in the 1970 catalogue raisonné. I'll leave it here. As these two examples illustrate, a catalogue raisonné's publication date is of critical importance, especially around those years of 1933 to 1945. The publication date can also show when claimants and purchasers had certain knowledge publicly available to them in making a claim or in doing their due diligence. In such cases, the catalogue raisonné itself is documentary evidence, as the information in it is effectively date stamped. In this sense, the trend toward online catalogue raisonnés poses challenges for provenance research. IFAR's database currently lists 150 online catalogue raisonnés, with many more currently in preparation. One benefit of the online catalogue raisonné over the analog catalog is that it's not out of date as soon as it's printed. Rather, the information in it is continually updated and overwritten, which can be hard to track. Online catalogs also have publication date ranges spanning the life of the project. It can actually be quite difficult for many of these projects to ascertain exactly when they began, because they don't actually have publication dates anywhere listed on the site. So future researchers may not be able to reconstruct exactly what information was available at any given time. Consequently, the information that we document in an online catalogue raisonné will be different from what someone will see 10, 20, 50 years from now looking at the same catalog, even assuming that the catalog still exists. And if this sounds somewhat ridiculous, remember, we've been talking about catalogs from 1928, which are, over 80 years ago. So they are still relevant in the long term. So as researchers, we need to devise new ways to document provenance in an online catalogue raisonné. For example, you might need to take a screenshot of the entry with the current date on it. You should note the date and see if that the entry was last updated, if that information is provided on the page. And a lot of places actually do say this entry was last updated, and they give the year. However, it can be difficult to find out exactly what was updated. And of course, contact the authors if they're available to find out if there's an edit log of what changes took place and when. There's also a risk, of course, that some online catalogue raisonnés will eventually cease to exist when there's no one left to update and maintain them. Fortunately, the New York Art Resources Consortium is archiving important born digital catalogue raisonnés. They currently, as the last time I checked, have 43 catalogue raisonnés that they are archiving via web crawlers, which will effectively archive the project on a continual basis. Nevertheless, IFAR's database knows of at least 150, with at least another 150 currently in preparation. So currently, that's obviously a fraction of the total number. Nevertheless, especially the smaller independent projects may simply disappear with no records left behind them. Hopefully, however, the NIARC and other web archiving initiatives will help ensure the longevity of born digital catalogs for future research. My last example deals with how catalogue raisonnés in making a statement on attribution can also be instructive when doing provenance research. One restitution recently in the news shows how authenticity and provenance intersect in the catalogue raisonné. last month, a painting of Lot and his daughters, said to be by Nicolas Poussin, was returned to the heirs of René and Suzanne Bloch. They were a Jewish couple from Strasbourg who fled in 1939, leaving their collection with his cousin Emile Bloch in Poitiers. Emile Bloch's family was deported to the death camps in 1944, and their possessions were seized by the Nazis. After the war, the painting was listed as attributed to Poussin in the Directory of Property Looted in France, published in 1947 by France's Restitution Bureau. And we're looking at that here. You can see how the work was listed with a photograph. Despite the news reports touting the return of the Poussin, the painting's attribution had changed in the intervening years. And indeed, when this work was found by a sharp-eyed Dutch collector, it was being shown at TEFAF Maastricht by a Milanese gallery, which was attributing the painting to the Italian painter Alessandro Turchi, called L'Orbetto. Changes in attribution are common with missing World War II works from private collections, where in many cases the attribution was self-reported by the owners. Consequently, if you were looking for Lot and his daughters in Anthony Blunt's 1966 Poussin Catalogue Raisonné, Wilde's 1980 Catalogue Raisonné, or Christopher Wright's 2007 Poussin Catalogue Raisonné, you would not find this work mentioned. To state the obvious, this painting's absence from the Poussin literature is a signal to broaden your search and include other artists. The researcher could then try looking for it using other criteria, such as on the painting's subject matter, or using a reverse image search, or searching under what might be known of its earlier provenance. And this painting had a very distinguished early provenance. Whether or not the heirs knew about that, is unknown. But these were research paths that might, with some luck, lead to the correct attribution, or even to the right catalogue raisonné, where you might just find it hiding in plain sight. And now I want to turn it over to Jennifer Mass.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Lisa, and thank you to Sharon and all of IFAR for having me here tonight and for the excellent work that you do. I want to also say that so many of the presentations that have preceded me involve situations that we've encountered in our work at SAFA. And so I want to give a couple of examples of how our scientific work has contributed to the provenance process. Okay, so I'm going to talk about two very diverse projects here, one archaeological example and one 20th century example, where we really needed the scientific study of a cultural heritage object in order to fully understand the provenance of the work. In one case, Faux Dead Sea Scrolls, and in another case, painting that had been through a proto-fascist attack prior to the Second World War. So in general, provenance research on the Dead Sea Scrolls seems very straightforward. We know that they come from the caves of Qumran, which are shown here, and then also how those caves relate to the position of the Dead Sea here. But it turns out that there were some questions about fragments of Dead Sea Scrolls that had an unusual provenance and entered the antiquities market post-2002 and have now become scattered throughout museum, university, and private collections. So in order to understand how science informs provenance in this case, we have to actually look inside the Qumran caves, and I'm showing cave number 4 here. The caves are carved out of sedimentary rock. You can see the layers of sediment here. So I'm taking us all back to 8th grade geology. And the reason that these sedimentary deposits are important is because they're made out of a specific type of stone called marlstone. Marlstone is a mixture of limestone and clay. Limestone is calcium carbonate. But it turns out there's actually many physical forms of calcium carbonate, and 2 of them are calcite and aragonite. So the chemical formula remains the exact same, but there's a slight physical arrangement of the atoms that's different. And this may seem like a very minor detail, but in fact, we'll see it's critical when it comes to provenance. And you can see very nicely in this slide why mineralogy matters, that we have tremendous amounts of sediment that have deposited onto the Dead Sea Scrolls. And we can use that sediment to gain information about whether or not the scroll that we're looking at actually came from Qumran. So here's a close-up look of the two minerals, aragonite and calcite, the two different forms of calcium carbonate. And so here we have just one of many geochemical signatures of the Qumran caves from the Dead Sea region. Okay, so it turns out that when we study these minerals using a technique called infrared spectroscopy, which I'm showing over here, we can actually nicely tell the difference between these two minerals that, again, they're chemically identical, but they just have a slightly different physical arrangement. And so just pointing out these two peaks here, you can see that we can distinguish them. So when we looked at the Dead Sea Scroll mineral sediments under the spectrometer, what we found is that the Museum of the Bible Dead Sea Scroll mineral sediments contained no aragonite, and that immediately called the Qumran provenance of these fragments into question. But of course, provenance is not just about geology or chemistry, it's also about people. And so I want to take a look at provenance study that we did of the Dead Sea Scrolls from the Museum of the Bible collection, which I'll call MOTB for short. The putative provenance for the studied scrolls to date is shown here. The scrolls were excavated by Bedouins who then transferred ownership to an antiquities dealer in Jerusalem named Khalil Iskander Shaheen, also known as Kondo. And then the works were supposed to have passed by descent to his son, William Kondo, shown here. Now we have William Kondo selling the fragments of the Dead Sea Scrolls to Steve Green, someone whose name needs no introduction in the antiquities trade. And then ultimately, he gives these works to the Museum of the Bible. So can we find any scientific evidence in order to verify this provenance? Because the lack of aragonite is a real problem in terms of these fragments having even originated from the Qumran caves. And this work is surrounded by a growing understanding that the post-2002 Dead Sea Scroll fragments on the antiquities market are problematic. And so I'm raising just two red flags here. One of them is from Emmanuel Tove, who's from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, who noted that for the MOTB collection, of the 13 fragments in the collection, 12 of them were scripture texts, so that's 92%. And this is exceptionally high when you consider that of all the scrolls found at Qumran, only 23% of them contain scripture. So that's a red flag right there. And then next we have Kip Davis's work at Trinity Western University. He notes that in the post-2002 Dead Sea Scrolls, they're written with hesitant and inconsistent Hebrew lettering. The letters appear to be squeezed in order to fit into the damaged edges of the fragments. And so essentially it looks like the substrate fragments first, and then the inscription is added. Here's an example of the Genesis scroll fragment from MOTB, and we're looking at it in visible light here where you can see the mineral sediments, and then also in infrared imaging, where you can read the text much easier. What I wanted to show, anyone that's had a leather couch or a leather handbag, for example, they know that leather cracks over time and it delaminates, it starts to flake and the surface flakes off. Well, just the same thing has happened in these examples of ancient leather. And so what we're looking at in this image from the Genesis scroll is delamination, where this is the intact leather surface and this is the delaminated surface revealing material underneath. And you can see that the inscription goes right over the delamination. And so again, it looks like this is an ancient substrate to which a modern inscription has been added. And this is a higher magnification view of some of these cream-colored mineral deposits that turned out to be calcite and various forms of clay rather than aragonite. And this is an example of the Leviticus scroll. So here's our infrared image and our visible light image, and all of the scroll fragments post 2002 are extremely darkened, and you really do need infrared light in order to read the inscriptions. In this case, what we're able to see is that we have a crack at the edge of the fragment, and that the ink of the inscription actually falls into the crack. And so we have, again, an example of a leather fragment that appears to have been aged, and then the inscription was added afterwards. And I have this wonderful 3D image that shows the ink actually falling into the crack, which is not what we should expect to see. All right, now I'm going to change gears entirely and move into the interwar period and look at works by Yves Tanguy, a surrealist painter that did these amazing, luminous, and sometimes a little bit scary dreamscapes that you see here. And I'm showing masterpieces from different points in his career. And like a lot of the surrealists, he was quite experimental in his technique, using some of the techniques such as collage, grattage, where he's scraping with an implement into the paint layer, frottage, where he's rubbing paint off of the surface of the composition, or coudrage, where he's even using threads in the genesis of his composition. So in terms of any provenance problems with Yves Tanguy, one of the important ones is called L'Affaire de l'Âge d'Or. And this actually happened in December 3rd of 1930. And it revolves around a movie that was shown at Studio 28 Cinema in Paris, a movie theater that still exists today. The movie in question was a movie by Luis Buñuel and Salvador Dali called L'Âge d'Or. And the movie was a left-wing attack on the interwar social order of that was made by the surrealists. So it was really intended to be controversial. It attacked the sexual mores of the bourgeoisie, the institutions of the family, and the Catholic Church. This film is now considered to be an avant-garde tour de force, but at the time it caused a riot, forcing the movie to close after 2 weeks, and it would not be seen again until, I believe, the 1980s. So a little bit about the riot and the aftermath and how this plays into the problem of the provenance of the paintings involved. The riot was caused by the French League of Patriots and also the French Anti-Jewish Youth League. So we have these right-wing reactionaries that in 1930 are giving us a little taste of what's going to happen in Europe towards the end of the 1930s. When they attack the showing of the movie, they throw ink at the screen, they physically attack patrons of the film, and then they attack a display of surrealist art in the lobby. In the process, they destroy works by Miro, by Man Ray, by Tanguy, and by Salvador Dali. It's been documented that 3 works by Yves Tanguy were in this exhibit, and the question becomes what happened to them after this event. And do all of them survive to the present day? Well, one of the works that I'm showing here that you can see very clearly in the black and white images from 1930 of the aftermath of the attack showed up at Christie's in 2019. And it was suspicious because this work appeared to be in excellent condition. It didn't show any of the physical evidence of its provenance of what had happened to it in the 1930 attack. And at that time, we were fortunate to be working with Charlie Stuckey and with Stephen Mack, and who are working on the catalog raisonné for Yves Tanguy. And they invited me and my team over to have a look at the painting together. And indeed, when we were at the auction house looking at the front of the painting, it appeared to be in excellent condition. And likewise, for the reverse of the painting, there was no evidence of this anti-Jewish League attack or the League of Patriots attack, or physical evidence of the provenance. And on the spot at an auction house, you're actually pretty limited in terms of the different tools that you can bring to bear to study a work and make a rapid decision. And so at that time, we were really only able to do visible analysis of the painting between 400 and 700 nanometers, and then expand outward in the electromagnetic spectrum, use a little bit higher energy to do ultraviolet examination of the painting at 365 nanometers. And the ultraviolet image, again, did not reveal the damage. And we often get a tremendous amount of information about the condition of the painting through the ultraviolet image. But in this case, all we can see is this dark mark right here. What this is showing us is this is paint that's been applied over this green hazy fluorescence of a natural resin varnish. And this is an important thing to remember about ultraviolet imaging, and something that's commonly misunderstood. Ultraviolet only tells us about overpaint or restoration paint that's been added to the painting on top of the varnish, and not anything about what's happening underneath the varnish. We were fortunate to be able to take the painting back to our studio and do infrared imaging, so try and penetrate beneath the restoration paint and study it between 800 and 1250 nanometers. And again, nothing, raising serious concerns that this was perhaps a later copy of a work that perhaps had been destroyed in the L'Age d'Or incident. And so again, we don't see the condition matching the provenance. However, in this case, multispectral imaging really saved the day for us. And back in Sapa's studio, what we were able to do is determine physical evidence of the provenance of the work by doing an X-radiograph, so going to even more penetrating, higher energy radiation. What we could see quite clearly is that the original work, you can see, had its tacking margins here in the 1930 image, and those had all been cut down, and the painting had been mounted to a second canvas, which explained why the back of the painting showed no evidence of damage. What we also see in the X-ray image, all of this spotty damage is mold damage that you might expect if the piece had been rolled up and put away after the attack. And then in the center of the painting, we see cracking and loss that is likely due to the rolling of the canvas at some time. But most importantly, what we see are the mends of the slashing of the canvas that happened in 1930. And so finally, we have physical evidence of this painting being the same painting that we see in this black and white image before the war. And I thought this was a particularly important example because in restitution cases, Lisa just gave an excellent example of how the attribution of the painting can change over time. We see the dimensions of the painting change over time. We see very aggressive restoration treatments done to paintings in the 1960s and the 1970s, sometimes I think to really obfuscate the identity of the painting so that restitution is not possible. And so when someone is involved in a restitution claim, often they're trying to claim that a black and white image that they might have from the 19-teens and 1920s is the same as a painting standing in front of them that now looks quite different than what they had in their ancestors' collection. And so scientific analysis has become critical in restitution claims to understanding how the work has physically changed over time. And Sharon also mentioned the labels. We see lots of cases where, as she mentioned, unfortunately, labels fall off, and then we see labels that are added that we can use a number of scientific methods to show that these are false labels as well, to try and obfuscate the location of the painting during the war. So at this point, I want to say that this was very much a couple of interdisciplinary projects and would have been absolutely impossible without all of the scientists and art conservators and art historians who worked with us on this research. And so I hope I've included everyone. I want to thank everyone listed here, and in particular, Charlie Stuckey and Stephen Mack, bringing to our attention the Tanguy painting at Christie's. I want to thank IFAR again for putting together this wonderful night of presentations. And I now have the distinct pleasure of introducing Tom Kline, who actually got me started on the Dead Sea Scrolls research. And he's an esteemed colleague from the Cultural Heritage Partners.
Thank you, Jennifer, for that very kind introduction. I'd like to thank members of the audience for your interest in this subject, and indeed for your endurance surviving towards the end of the evening. And I want to thank, of course, Sharon Flescher for including me in this fantastic panel, and for the wonderful professionals that work with her. I had a couple of points I wanted to make tonight. The first one, Lynn Nicholas covered most of for me, which under the subject of law governing provenance, there is none. There are no legal requirements, no specific legal requirements, as Lynn said. So we fall back to basic law, which is law of misrepresentation or admission, or even fraud, as we've heard in some of the cases. So the fact that there is no specific requirement means that you leave things out based on your professional judgment at your own risk. But that's where things are. Museums, dealers, auction houses are left to their professional judgment to determine what matters need to be addressed in a provenance and which matters can be left out. But there's always the civil law to fall back on, as Lynn said, if these provenances end up being subjected to scrutiny. So what I'd like to do now is share my screen and show you a few slides and go through a few matters that either I've handled or other people have handled that show you how provenance operates in the marketplace and in the courtroom. We can start with my first art law case involving mosaics from the Kanakaria Church. These were the very famous mosaics. They were published by Dumbarton Oaks in DC, Premier Center for Byzantine Art. And that is the provenance from the church, published in the early 70s. Cyprus was invaded, occupied, Northern Third in 1974. And these mosaics were gone probably by 79. This is the Christ that you see in the center of the composition, and also in this fragment that we recovered from litigation in Indianapolis, and you see what the apse of the church looks like now. So the buyer was a dealer who acquired them with what the New York Times called a cock and bull story about an archaeologist and a defunct church. So she did very little provenance research. In fact, one of the things she did do was contact IFAR, but she didn't want to pay the $25 for a search of the database. So we see that ignoring diligence is done at your own risk. This is the famous case of the Sevso silver, now getting a little long in the tooth. the silver appeared on the market at Sotheby's and drew 3 claims from Lebanon, Yugoslavia, later Croatia, and then Hungary. But none of the claims had any specificity. They were all very general, silver plates of different sizes and nothing highly specific. So this was the odd case where person buying with no provenance was able to escape with the objects because all of the 3 claims failed. Of course, by then it was hard to market the pieces, and they've been gradually moving into collections since then. This is one of my favorite cases involving a very unusual, indeed unique pectoral from Egypt. It left Egypt in the 1870s and ended up on the market. It didn't sell at Sotheby's, so it sold in a private sale to the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. And this is the actual provenance that you can find on the website of the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, that it was actually not stolen from Egypt, but stolen from Lafayette College. And I'm sure that Museum of Fine Arts in Boston was not told that. They were told some other story, which would be interesting to know in detail. But whatever it was, they accepted a false story, acquired this object. Lafayette College later made a claim, and Museum of Fine Arts got to buy it twice. And you can see the story here. This is probably the most frank provenance you'll see on a museum website, that the object was stolen and that it was purchased by the MFA from a Mr. Granger. Couldn't necessarily explain cogently why a no-name dealer or collector in Eastern Pennsylvania had this incredibly remarkable object, but eventually all was made well through a settlement. This is a case I handled involving what's called a Book of Nobles. This is the Augsburg Book of Nobles, which belonged to the predecessor to the State Art Gallery in Stuttgart. And you can see in the lower left-hand corner a stamp of the collection that they were in, that this book was in. It was to me it's a book, but to many of you it's a bound volume of prints and drawings. It honors the entry of 99 families into the nobility, each one recognized by the symbol of the family. Unfortunately, the book was placed in a warehouse in a town in Waldenburg that ended up being the scene of very heavy fighting. This is the 63rd Infantry Division moving through a Berlin-like landscape as the battle raged. It was taken by an American officer, much like the Quedlinburg treasures, and it was offered for sale by his nephews after his death in Clayton, Missouri, in suburban St. Louis, where there's apparently a coterie of book dealers. So a whole group of book dealers looked at this this book. I've just blown up the symbol here, which had its provenance on every page, where it came from. No other provenance except it was being sold by the nephews of a World War II veteran. So we see again the lack of attention to provenance. This is not so long ago, 10, 12 years ago. And the consequences were that Baden-Württemberg, the state of Baden-Württemberg, recovered this book in litigation. This is one of the first cases that I saw in the World War II area, a painting called The Washerwoman by Gabriel Metzu. It was in the National Gallery of Poland and was a documented loss there. And it was sold in 1988 with this provenance. Lazienski Palace, which is part of the National Gallery of Warsaw, and then Private Collection Germany. And when it came up to market in 1993 at a top-ranked auction house, I was told, well, it was a good faith purchase in 1988, and the buyer in 1988 is the seller now, so they have title under French law, which applies in Monaco. If this is not a good faith purchase, this is as clear an evidence of provenance showing looting as I have seen, except when it says looting. This is what Warsaw looked like when the Germans were done with them. Every building, nearly every building was destroyed. For an object to leave the National Gallery and go into a German collection is clearly a provenance that shows that it's a very problematic object. Last example I'll give is Landscape with Smokestacks, a monotype by Edgar Degas that became the subject of litigation. It had been owned by a Jewish banking family in the Netherlands, sent to Paris at the last minute to Jewish dealers who put it into storage. After the war, the warehouse where it was stored was empty. The ERR that Mark talked about had been there but not inventoried this piece. A work on paper that would not have been very valuable then. And when we saw the provenance, we said, this is the pipeline. Point number one, Lutyens' collection. Lutyens was a dealer who acquired this for the Gutmann family. So the Gutmann family does not appear in the provenance, but the dealer representing them did. So presumably that's consistent with the ethic at some point. And then we see Hans Wendland, who was one of the worst of the Nazi looters, his brother-in-law Hans Funkhauser in Basel, and then Emil Wolf in New York. And when we saw this, my thought was, this is the pipeline from Paris to New York for Nazi looted art. Now, as Sharon always points out to me, no one knew Hans Wendland or Hans Funkhauser at the time, but nonetheless, we see a provenance with a huge gap in time between 1932 and 1951. We see the object in Paris, going to Switzerland. So this is a provenance that to me should have raised some suspicions. Later, the work was exhibited in smaller, not first-rank museums, and there were post-war publications. So you can see a handful of issues for this piece going to litigation. Ultimately was settled, and the piece is now at the Art Institute of Chicago. So just a quick look at this. This slide comes to me from Karen Daly at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts. And when they had a claim on a portrait of Jean d'Albon, they had to check and see which Jean d'Albon they had, and they found at least 7 others. So provenance research in this case meant research of at least 8 paintings. So what do we learn from this little walk through a real life experience? A good provenance does not guarantee title, but it's one tool along with the others that you've heard about tonight. There is no clear law on how much diligence a buyer or a possessor must do. That's an issue that's being litigated. Whether a buyer of art that's been kicking around for a while should do some due diligence in every case, or whether the diligence is only to resolve red flags or conflicts is simply not resolved. So I leave you with the thought to regard provenance with skepticism and to engage professionals to do the research that's needed, which, as has been observed, is not just art historical research, but can be much broader, including history of exhibition, publication, legal issues of particularly ownership issues. One of my favorite cases, I was approached on a claim made by an heir against the museum, and before very long, there was a different claimant because the first claimant only had a life interest called the usufruct, and the museum didn't own the work. It was bought by the museum director for his family. So both the claimant and the claim recipient were changed due to things that were found through the provenance research. And with that, I'd like to turn it back to Sharon Flescher. Thank you for your attention and again, for your interest in this area.
I'd like Tom to stay here and to invite the other speakers to come back onto the screen. So make yourselves visible and unmute yourself. And before anything else, let me thank you all. I was a speaker too, but now I'm thanking all the other speakers. So thank you all. You really did a great job. So many different aspects of provenance research came up now. We went over our time a little bit. We're 5 minutes over. I'm going to make an executive decision here. We have a few questions. We're not going to get to all of them, but we'll try to take a few, but we will definitely end by 6. I have to say, Tom, that some people want lawyers here because there were a few questions, though there weren't as many questions as I anticipated, but a few of them were directed at you. And then there were some other general ones. So one, let me just say, someone asked a question about whether we were going to make these slides available. And the answer to that is no. What we are doing is recording the program, doing a Zoom recording of the program, and we will post this on our website. So we'll send an email to registrants to say that we've posted it on our website. So we're not making slides per se available, we're making the program available to you. So I hope that suffices for the person who asked that question. So I'm going to start with a question to Jennifer, which I think is a little bit of a maybe misunderstanding of something, but the question says, the scientific presentation of the post-202 Dead Sea Scrolls was very interesting, but what was your conclusion? Were they fakes? And isn't this an example more of a question of authenticity and not so much provenance? But I want to interject before you even answer that latter part. As I said in my introduction, provenance, or in my talk, I can't remember now, provenance is an integral part of authenticity research. So there is an overlap there. So we've addressed that part of the question. Jennifer, if you can answer the other part of the question.
Absolutely. There's been a lot of issues with the corpus of Dead Sea Scrolls, mostly fragmentary, that were released after 2002. And I just had the opportunity to talk about them in the briefest terms. But absolutely, we started with the provenance. In terms of the provenance does not seem to be right. We're not seeing any of that particular mineral aragonite that we should expect to see. But we didn't want to end the project there. We wanted to really go further and say, okay, the different caves at Qumran have different ratios of calcite to aragonite. So we should also do some more analysis, and mostly microscopic analysis, that wound up showing that while the substrates were antiquities, in fact, the writing was modern. And this is something that we're seeing more and more with these ancient inscriptions. And so people will find ancient materials and then write something on them, often something that's going to be revolutionary to the field of the scholars that study this work. And so, yes, it did wind up encompassing both provenance and authenticity. So yes, the works are fake, they're not right.
It's very rare that one hears someone say outright a work is fake, but this is fake. So someone asks, do we see the provenance law changing? But I'm not sure there is a provenance law. Tom, do you want to answer that?
Well, I think that's exactly right, Sharon. We did see the federal government address the statute of limitations for Holocaust-related recovery claims. We don't see any movement. It would have to be in New York for there to be specific law. So what we're going to see, I predict, of course, predicting the future, as Yogi Berra says, predictions are very difficult, especially about the future. I think the case law is evolving. we're in a transitional period, but we've always been in a transitional period. I think what Lynn mentioned about provenance coming under increasing scrutiny and litigation is particularly true, as is the duty to investigate provenance. So I look for developments in the area of case law, but at the moment, there's no consensus. There's some very strong holdings that the average buyer has no obligation to conduct provenance research, and I think maybe other developments as well.
Thank you. Tom, since you're on the screen, a doctoral student has a question. I'm only going to ask part of it. Would it be possible to reopen the Casira Thyssen-Bonamissa case in Spain? Because the California ruling is based on only the first 2 paragraphs of Article 55. We're getting kind of into the weeds here, specialized. So let's.
I have an answer ready for that. That's a little too much into the weeds. That's a case I think that's been up to the Ninth Circuit 3 times
now. Yes.
So I'm not 100% sure it's done being litigated in the United States, but there is a growing resistance, as we saw in the Supreme Court, to litigating these cases in the United States, and that's a case. Typically, they come here because the statute of limitations and the good faith purchase rules in Europe. So it might be possible to bring it in Spain, but there would also be other barriers.
Okay, so now, Marc, there's a question for you. Who's currently doing the best work on dealer networks during and after World War II? We know there's the Frick History Collecting Department, and also Getty has one too. There's a book out on dealers. Do you have an answer to that?
Well, the latest effort comes out of France, actually. The Institut National de l'Histoire de l'Art is putting the final touches, unless the project is already out, on the dealers who were active in Paris during the Second World War. So I think it's one of the most recent and probably more comprehensive projects that addresses this issue of dealer networks.
I think that Jonathan Natan is the son of the dealer. Natan is also putting together some sort of a compilation of histories of dealers and the timelines of where dealers were at any certain time, because a lot of them moved, they had operations in the United States as well as in Europe. These are very important to what somebody was talking about, I think Lisa, about how things, the physical movement of paintings is very important. And so that should contribute a certain amount to the whole thing.
Mm-hmm. So another question here from someone who I presume is in the marketplace. If I put a generic waiver on provenance research, such as, quote, we use our best judgment and thorough research, but be aware there may still be errors, does it protect from lawsuits? Who wants to tackle that?
It sounds like it's aimed to me. I have to say,
No.
yeah. Thank you, Lynn. That's the common sense answer and the legal answer match up. It couldn't hurt, I guess, as they say in New York, but it's not a substitute for doing your own provenance research and stating a provenance that reflects more than superficial information. How do you like that, Lynn?
Okay. Anyway, this is the good old USA where everyone thinks he has his day in court. He's owed his day in court. So, Marc, another one specifically for you. What kind of technology are you using for your database?
The data model is being created in Airtable. And then from Airtable, it'll be migrated into a Wikibase, which is a graph database. So that's the very short answer, but it doesn't require any more than that.
Okay. Some of the other questions are very specific. I'm going to take just one more because I already have gone over my own statement about 7 p.m. We're at 7:01. But let me just combine two, and Tom, you'll get a laugh at one of them because someone asks, what about NFTs in terms of provenance research? And then not quite related, but in the same larger category of new things happening. How does anyone feel how the anti-money laundering laws will affect provenance research? These are conferences in them of themselves and evenings in and of themselves. But if anyone wants to take a quick shot at this, Tom, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I'll just note that blockchain developments, particularly leading towards NFTs, are very important developments to try to firm up provenance, make it less flexible, make it more locked in. These are the kind of developments you see from the private sector, particularly when there's no development on the government sector setting rules. So I look to these as for the future, is developments that will lead us to maybe a better world of provenance where people can choose to make provenance more fixed through a blockchain.
And do you want to tackle that anti-money money laundering? Lynn raised her hand, so I'm not sure which of the two components.
The money laundering thing is that, I mean, what you need for good provenance research is good funding of things like IFAR, excuse me.
Thank you.
But also the big museum programs, the Getty, and many other programs. And so that should not have anything to do with money laundering. I mean, if you need the expert people to be able to do the research and have the facilities and the computers and the programs like what Marc's doing to, make it complete. And so if something is laundered and something's fishy about something, it will be, more obvious more quickly.
Thank you. So with that, we're only a few minutes over my extended time, but I wanted to take a few questions. I'm sorry, I apologize to the few people whose questions I couldn't get to, but I got to as many as I could handle. Let me take one more look and see if there's something that really might make sense, but some just came as I was questioning, so I hadn't been able to look so closely. But Marc, I'll address this to you because it's very basic. What is the ERR that everyone keeps referring to? So I won't answer it, you answer that.
The Einsatzstab Heischlader Rosenberg, or Task Force Rosenberg. It was established in 1939 by Alfred Rosenberg, who basically was hung at Nuremberg for his role in the in masterminding the final solution. And the ER at its peak had about 10,000 employees whose sole purpose in life was to spend all their time cataloging, indexing, sorting looted material from all across Europe.
Okay, so I'm sorry, I really apologize to the people who sent in questions that we couldn't get to. The program was long, but not too long, I think, because the talks were really good, and I hope you all appreciated them and benefited from them. I learned as well from them. So forgive us for those of you we didn't ask the questions of. I'm sorry. I'm just going to repeat that we are recording this program, including the Q&A. And as soon as it's ready, we will notify the registrants of the program and post it on our website. So stay tuned for that. Also, I want to remind you that Lund Humphries, we are co-publishers with Lund Humphries, but they are the ones selling the book, not IFAR. We don't make any money on those book sales. That they have made this offer to IFAR registrants of the program and IFAR member supporters of a 30% discount on the book. If you would like it, it's a good book, not just because I'm in it and Jennifer and Marc, but many other people whom I couldn't have on the program. So there's a limited time offer. We're going to put up a slide to end this program, how you can go about getting the book if you want it. Obviously, no obligation, but if you want it. And with that, I'm going to sign off. Everyone else is going to sign off. We're going to post the announcement about the book. And I want to thank all the attendees who stayed, all of you who attended, and all of my speakers especially. Bravo. It's an important subject. Bravo, you did a great job. Thank you.